Since Boise State Public Radio was founded, students have been an integral part of day-to-day operations.
I'm Jamie Geary, and I'm a Humanities and Cultural Studies major at Boise State University. Working at Boise State Public Radio, to me, means helping all voices in our community be heard.
You can fund our student programs with your generous gift on Bronco Giving Day. Learn more and support at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. On Tuesday, February 18th, President Donald Trump announced he was firing the U.S. attorneys who had not already stepped down. He called the Department of Justice politicized, and he said getting rid of all 93 Biden-era attorneys would, quote, restore confidence in our justice system. Now, the news came 4 days after Idaho U.S. Attorney Josh Hurwit announced he was leaving the office. He was confirmed in 2022 under President Joe Biden, but did have the support of Idaho's GOP senators Jim Risch and Mike Crapo. He fought fentanyl, drug dealers, and violent crimes while in this position. And during his tenure, he launched initiatives to fight fraud as well as hate crimes and child abuse, and to also raise awareness to slow the spread of illegal opioid use. And he has been a frequent guest here on Idaho Matters, and he is joining us once again. Josh, really nice to have you on the program.
Gemma, it's always great to be with you.
So can we just begin our conversation today with some of your accomplishments during your time in office? Because you prosecuted a number of drug trafficking cases.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about this, but these accomplishments are those of my colleagues and our law enforcement partners working together in really strong partnership. And I think that's the foundation for these cases that you're referring to.
You spent a lot of energy fighting fentanyl. How bad would you say the problem is here in Idaho?
It's the way I look at it is until there are no deaths from fentanyl, no overdoses from fentanyl, no poisonings from fentanyl, then we have to continue working as hard as we've been working on this problem. There are some signs that nationwide and in Idaho, there are fewer deaths from fentanyl and maybe fewer overdoses. We're seeing, anecdotally, slightly less fentanyl on the streets over the past maybe 6 months. However, it's still prevalent. People are still dying from fentanyl. And so the work continues, and our focus, my colleagues' focus, will continue to be on fentanyl.
In fact, you set up a special fentanyl training for police officers. Can you talk to us about that program and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. This was an idea that several of our prosecutors had, along with our now retired law enforcement coordinator, because what we realized was when you look at where overdoses are happening across the country and in Idaho, being a rural state, there's not a big difference between what we see in rural communities and urban communities in terms of the chances of people being affected by fentanyl. There was a big difference, though, in terms of the tools and the resources and the training that our rural law enforcement agencies had compared to, let's say, agencies in Ada County, for example. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to try to bridge that gap, and we did that with a whole host of partners, and I hope I don't leave out any, but the Idaho Office of Drug Policy, which is under the governor's office, it's a state agency, the DEA, and Idaho State Police. We put on 3 to date, 2-day trainings. We had one in Nampa, we had one in Twin Falls, we had one in Idaho Falls. The next one, in its planning stages, is going to be up in Lewiston. The idea is to do it in these areas where we can not only work with those particular agencies in those cities, but draw in smaller police agencies from our rural parts of Idaho to give them really the latest training in terms of intelligence about what fentanyl is, how we're seeing it, what forms it's taking, how it's trafficked, but also how to respond to an overdose situation, because it needs to be treated like a crime scene in order for either county prosecutors or my federal colleagues to be able to hold people accountable.
Also, talk to us about some summits you put on during your time in regards to fentanyl, because you had a fentanyl family summit. You also supported Idaho's first fentanyl youth summit. Why were these summits important to put on and engage this particular part of our community?
Yeah, great question. I look at the fentanyl problem not only in terms of a law enforcement response and prosecutions of criminals. Obviously, that's sort of what the bread and butter is for us at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But you need awareness in order to reduce the demand and protect people. And you also need prevention strategies with youth. And then you need recovery strategies for people and families that have been affected by any substance abuse disorder. So our strategy in working with, again, a whole host of partners and really educational institutions and school districts on both the Family Summit and the Youth Summit was to sort of take off our law enforcement hat and work with professionals who understand how to engage with, for the Youth Summit, it was kids, how to get them thinking about not only what the threats are, but how they can make good, healthy decisions and influence their peers. Obviously, peer-to-peer influence is much more effective than listening to a lecture from a prosecutor like myself. So we were trying to develop just new strategies to see what would take off. And I think both the Family Summit, which was families talking about the devastating experiences they had, both to support each other, but also raise awareness when they wanted to through that event, was really impactful in our community and gave them a voice. And then with the Youth Summit, it's been great to see how this has started in 3 school districts in the Treasure Valley, and then there's current discussions to do it in about 6 or 7 other school districts because of the great feedback that we got, not just from the schools, but from the actual students about the day that we went through it together.
I also want to talk about another big part of your job, and that was fighting child predators. Can you talk to us about the Project Safe Childhood program?
Yeah, another, as you mentioned, extremely important part of what U.S. Attorney's offices around the country and then here in Idaho do to keep our communities safe. It is an initiative nationwide where law enforcement works really hand in hand with federal prosecutors to find, detect, and then prosecute individuals who are online trying to prey on children and commit sexual crimes involving children and the internet. We had about 135 of these cases that were either sentenced or started while I was U.S. Attorney. That gives you a sense of the magnitude of this problem. We could devote a lot more resources to this as a country, I think, and still be very, very busy finding these individuals who you want to take advantage of young people. It could be really young kids. It could be teenagers through things like sextortion. It even delves into or blends into human trafficking on occasion. And so we were really proud of the partnerships that we built, again, with state agencies, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which is housed in the state AG's office, Homeland Security Investigations, which is our main partner at the federal level, but then state agencies and county sheriff's office, police departments throughout the state were involved in all the types of cases that I mentioned, again, both in rural and urban areas, so that we had a great ability to cover the state. And it's something that I know my colleagues are going to continue to be very successful at, is holding these people accountable.
During your time, you also created a COVID-19 fraud task force. Can you talk to us about what this is and how successful this program was?
Yeah, this has been something that came out of necessity, right? It wasn't something that in 2016 anyone had on their radar when you looked at the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Department of Justice more widely. The COVID pandemic, for better or for worse, there was a lot of relief funds that were misused by companies, by individuals who took advantage of the funding that was provided by Congress to essentially float our economy through this really devastating pandemic. For me, having spent a lot of my time as an assistant United States attorney focused on fraud and these types of abuses, it was important that we had a very proactive response to this, that we didn't just wait for tips to come in to law enforcement and then for those to make their way either to our county friends or to our office, but rather that we had an aggressive approach to find this fraud before it sort of bubbled up on its own, if that makes sense. So a couple prosecutors in my office took the reins on this effort, brought together 10 federal agencies. And what we did is we did data analytics to figure out, which loans that were provided through the pandemic relief programs had certain red flags, either about the applicant, the application itself, or perhaps there was information about how the money was being misused. Through that, we developed leads and then cases and then prosecutions. And as you mentioned, it's still ongoing, but it's been pretty successful with 17 criminal prosecutions so far, a handful of civil resolutions, and nearing $10 million just in Idaho in the last couple of years of recovery for the taxpayer.
I also want to talk about the fact that you worked quite a bit with the Native American tribes here in Idaho. In fact, you hosted a United Against Hate. These were forums. Talk to us a little bit about that and the importance of that relationship.
Absolutely. One of the core functions of a U.S. Attorney's Office is to serve as the federal prosecutor for felonies that occur on tribal land. So we have 5 reservations in Idaho. It's a very important relationship because they rely on the FBI and my office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, to prosecute all felonies that occur, with some minor exceptions. So unlike our relationship, let's say, with a county, we have very limited jurisdiction in terms of what we do when we're outside of tribal lands. On tribal lands, pretty much every crime that occurs is something that our office needs to be looking at and prosecuting as appropriate. So I was very proud and humbled to be able to continue the historical and positive relationships we've had in my office with all of these tribes, and to do some new things, to not just respond to crime, but to support these tribal communities. And as you mentioned, the United Against Hate initiative was one way to do this. Obviously, Native Americans are a very small minority in Idaho, but face significant prejudice and hate, and we've seen some of these incidents recently. So we hosted, I think, 7 total of these United Against Hate forums, which were aimed at encouraging the reporting and ultimately the prosecution of hate crimes. And I was very proud that 4 of the 5 tribes in our state partnered with us for at least one of those United Against Hate events.
I want to talk a little bit about the president's announcement that he was going to fire all 93 U.S. attorneys. I think some people might think, oh my gosh, this is a political move and all of that. And some of these attorneys have done good jobs. With that said, I mean, Josh, I am assuming this was actually not unexpected, because this is a very typical process that when there is a new administration, they do this. They come in and they put they choose the U.S. attorneys, the 93 U.S. attorneys.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't have had the chance to be a U.S. attorney if that wasn't the process, because I was able to be appointed after a very talented and good U.S. attorney, Bart Davis, left at the end of the first administration. And so when the election happened, I knew what my fate would be. And frankly, I expected to be asked to resign or fired, very soon after inauguration. And the fact that it didn't happen until mid-February, I thought was a very positive thing, not just for me personally to be able to continue to do this work, but it also helped, I think my office adjust to the transition that they're going through. So, it was expected, and it didn't create any real shock or anything like that at the office here.
Well, one thing I want to also discuss is the fact that when the president made this announcement, he did say it was going to restore confidence in our, quote, unfair justice system. Is that a reach? And I ask that, Josh, because this is typical in an administration change that U.S. attorneys either step down, resign, or fired from their position. So does that almost, make people start to wonder, well, should we have confidence in our justice system, in particular here in Idaho?
Yeah, I will limit my comments to Idaho. I think the results that my office has had and the fact that those have been generated through deep partnerships with sheriffs, many of whom are conservative, police chiefs who work for mayors across the state, and other law enforcement officers speaks for itself. In Idaho, I think there is deservedly really high confidence in law enforcement. Hopefully people saw through the work that my fellow prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office have done over the last couple of years, and that I've been able to highlight why that confidence should be there, and that there's really no daylight between local, state, and federal law enforcement here in Idaho. And I expect that to continue. And I think regardless of the politics of D.C. And the viewpoints that individuals rightly or wrongly have about the Department of Justice as a whole, in Idaho, we're really, really lucky. And I was always welcomed by my counterparts across the state. And I know that my successor will be as well. And it's really about doing the work and keeping people safe. And that's what I hope that people will be focused on.
So I'm curious about what's next. You live in Boise, and I ask this because I don't know if a lot of people would take a job knowing that the likelihood is in 4 years they're going to have to step down from it. I mean, maybe they get 8 years based on, if a president has 2 terms. So with that said, what are your plans?
Yes. So, like you said, I live in Boise. I love Idaho. I'm not leaving. I'm an Idahoan now, and grew up in Oregon, but have been here for 13 years. All of that time spent in the U.S. Attorney's Office in one role or another. And so I look forward to continuing to serve Idaho in some capacity. And I will be in Boise practicing law or doing something else where I can be useful to my fellow citizens and keep Idaho the wonderful place that it is, or contribute to doing that.
Well, before I let you go, I would love to know if you have a moment, a case where what are you proudest of during your time as Idaho's U.S. Attorney?
I can't pinpoint one case because I think even, let's say a run-of-the-mill case involves the pursuit and the accomplishment of justice, just like our biggest noteworthy cases do. A couple of things maybe I'd leave you with would be, one is, we're talking about all the cases that we did prosecute. People don't get to see the cases that we decide not to prosecute. When an investigation occurs, we have a decision to make whether there's enough evidence to obtain a conviction, or sometimes there's not, and we have to decline a matter for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because the evidence isn't there, even though we suspect that there was some sort of wrongdoing. So I'm really proud of the work that goes into that decision-making process, and it's outside the public eye as it should be. But I think if I can highlight for the public that my prosecutors, my friends that I worked with at the U.S. Attorney's Office, do the right things for the right reasons. I say that a lot. It doesn't just mean that they charge ahead aggressively all the time. They're respectful of the power that they wield as prosecutors. And so that's something that I'm really proud of as a cultural bedrock of our office. And then the second thing, I would just sort of expand beyond that and say there's a lot of attention right now on cutting the workforce at the federal level, these types of things. Everyone that I saw in my office in the 13 years that I was there deserved their paycheck and more, and deserved the thanks of every citizen in the country, and especially in Idaho, because these people aren't making a lot of money. They're spending their nights and weekends getting ready for cases. They're taking on the burdens of making sure that when we decide to prosecute someone or when we decide to take a position in federal court, it's absolutely the correct decision and it's supported by the law and the evidence. And their families are making these sacrifices too. Vacations get canceled. Kids' activities sometimes get missed because of the obligations of pursuing justice. And so I will always be an advocate for the folks in my office, for the Department of Justice, and all prosecutors in general. And I hope that the public can see from the work that we've done that these are not just platitudes, but it's the reality on the ground that's happening every day as we speak in the U.S. Attorney's Office and in prosecuting attorneys' offices around the state.
Well, Josh, it has been such a pleasure to have you on our program numerous times over these last 4 years, and we really appreciated all the time that you've given to us. So thank you for that, and best of luck as you move forward.
Thank you so much. It's always been a great treat to be here, and I wish everyone all the best.
We've been speaking with former Idaho U.S. Attorney Josh Hurwit about his time as the top law enforcement official here in the Gem State. He did step down earlier this month. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.